it's Dave, and welcome back to Zilog and Moto, the show where normally we take a look at all things 8 and 16-bit Sega. Well, except for the SG-1000, that is, unless I happen to win the lottery. For this episode, however, we're diverting a bit from the normal content of the channel. Today, we're not talking about a game for the Master System, or the Genesis, or the Sega CD, or the 32X. And in fact, we're not even talking about a game made by Sega. So why am I doing this review then? Well, because today's game is a very special game from a very special series. In fact, if it hadn't been for this series, I might not be here today doing this channel at all, and I might still be collecting comic books instead of video games. Let me take you back to the late 80s. Surprising on this channel, I know. During the summers, I would visit a local skating rink a few times a week, and when it was time to take a break from the skating, we would head over to the concession area, not just to get refreshments, but to also check out the small assortment of arcade machines that they had. Over the years, they changed them out a bit, but I specifically remember seeing machines like Popeye, Donkey Kong 3, Road Blasters, Baby Pac-Man, and a Cocktail Journey machine that I've never seen anywhere else. And those machines were fun and got my share of the quarters that I was supposed to spend on soda, but there was one machine that got played by someone every time we were there, and that was Double Dragon 2. I can't really explain what about that machine that got everyone going, but something about duking it out with hordes of different enemies was just really enticing. One of my good friends had the NES version, and it was great fun as well, but anyone who's played it knows it's not the same. A few years later, I would see Final Fight in the arcades for the first time, and it took the baton from Double Dragon 2 as the game I had to play at any arcade if I saw it there. It had bigger, more colorful characters and enemies, 3-player characters that played totally different, and a vastly improved control scheme. It was the perfect game for me at the time. But there was just one problem. I owned a Genesis, and Capcom wasn't working with Sega yet as a third party. So I knew that I wasn't getting even the censored mess of a game that landed on the Super Nintendo, much less the arcade version. However, unbeknownst to me at the time, Sega had a plan for this, as they knew just how popular the beat-em-up genre was, having their own fantasy and sci-fi beat-em-up titles in Golden Axe and Alien Storm. So they created their own take on Final Fight, called Streets of Rage, and actually beat Capcom to the punch, pun fully intended, releasing Streets of Rage on the Genesis 2 months before Final Fight would reach the Super Nintendo in late 1991. The original Streets of Rage was not a Final Fight killer. It had smaller, less detailed sprites, and enemy combat that feels a bit more like your target shooting than actual combat due to the somewhat robotic animations and movements of the enemies. But in absence of anything better, it got the job done, and it did have a fantastic soundtrack from Yuzo Koshiro, channeling some of what made Revenge of Shinobi such a great experience. And even with Streets of Rage's issues, it was a hit, scratching that itch of allowing Genesis players to beat up hordes of colorful gang members. However, while Streets of Rage was a hit, in January of 1993, the world would change for the Genesis owners with the release of Streets of Rage 2, a gigantic at the time console release consisting of 16 megabits. Streets of Rage 2 was better than the original in every conceivable way, and a game that shaped my early teenage years directly. Bigger characters, deeper levels, hidden power-ups, and amazingly, an even better soundtrack. I don't want to step on my eventual review of Streets of Rage 2 too much, but as Diamond Dave would say, those were damn good times. Unfortunately, with every meteoric rise without proper care and guidance, there's always a corresponding crash. In the case of Streets of Rage series, this crash is primarily at the hands of Sega of America. Bare Knuckle 3, the Japanese version of Streets of Rage 3, is a fine game, although the music definitely has caused a divided audience over the years. However, the problem with Streets of Rage 3 isn't Yuzo Koshiro's slightly different soundtrack, it's Sega of America's meddling with the game. Character sprites were censored and changed for no discernible reason, the story was altered, again for no discernible reason, and the difficulty was raised to a ridiculous default level. Unsurprisingly, Streets of Rage 3 became the black sheep of the Streets of Rage family, and with the game selling less and overall excitement for the series cooling off, Sega backed off producing future Streets of Rage games. effectively shelving the IP. While there were some small attempts to produce a new 3D Streets of Rage over the years, with the first attempt morphing into Fighting Force from Eidos, and a second attempt never making it past the alpha stage on the Dreamcast, Sega was content to leave this trilogy alone, just trotting it out occasionally on retro collections for newer systems. And then something crazy happened. Developer .mu, which has primarily concentrated on updating and releasing existing games, obtained a license to recreate Wonder Boy 3 for modern consoles. Sega, apparently impressed with .mu's work, decided to allow access to another long-dormant property, but this time not for a remake, for a completely new game. And thus, Streets of Rage 4 was born. So where is it? Isn't this part of the review where I show off the physical product? Yeah, about that. So in the United States, physical copies of the game are being distributed by Limited Run Games, and as usual for them, they aren't releasing an Xbox version. And I didn't really have any interest in a PS4 or Switch version. So, and I know this might be shocking, I was okay with only having the digital version of the game, which, by the way, is available on Xbox Game Pass right now if you're a subscriber on the Xbox or the PC. However, I found out literally today, thanks to George from G to the Next Level fame, as I was writing this review script, that Europe apparently doesn't play by the same rules. And Signature Edition Games was releasing it for Xbox, so I immediately dropped the cash for that. Of course, it won't show up for at least another month or so, but maybe I'll do a mini follow-up video on that when it shows, along with the rest of my Streets of Rage correction. Okay, well, I'm sure you're all tired of looking at me. Let's get to the game. Okay, so where to start? Well, to set the stage, Streets of Rage 4 is exactly what you would expect if you're familiar with the previous games in the series, or side-scrolling beat-em-ups in general. In fact, not only is it exactly what you'd expect, you could theoretically call certain parts of the game just a high-res reskinning of Streets of Rage 2 and 3, and not technically be wrong. Of course, the game is much more than that, and if anything should be described as an homage or love letter to the earlier titles in the series. But to put things plainly, if you're an old hand at playing the older titles in the series, picking up and playing the game with Axel or Blaze will feel like putting on an old glove or old pair of shoes. For experienced Streets of Rage players, the learning curve is very minimal, and players will be up and running immediately after they pick up the controller. If you noticed, I only mentioned Axel and Blaze's names in that previous paragraph. The reason for that is, by default, those are the only two characters that return from the previous Streets of Rage titles. When booting up the game for the first time, 4 characters are available out of the box, similar to Streets of Rage 2 and 3. Those characters are Axel and Blaze, along with newcomers Cherry Hunter, who is Adam Hunter's guitar-slinging daughter, and Floyd Auraria, an apprentice to Dr. Zahn from Streets of Rage 3. The series' timeline has moved up 10 years from the previous title, hence the replacement of Sammy, Eddie, Skade, yeah, that's it, and Dr. Zahn by Cherry and Floyd. Not that you could tell by looking at Axel and Blaze, with Axel simply growing a beard to look a little more grizzled, and Blaze not appearing to have aged a day. The game's plot more or less ignores the events of Streets of Rage 3, or Bare Knuckle 3, in a smart move, due to the issues that I mentioned earlier with the botched Americanization of the title. Instead, Big Bad Mr. X has been replaced by his twin children, Mr. and Miss Y. Really? I couldn't have come up with better names than that? Anyway, without much detail, Mr. and Miss Y have plotted to take over the city again, even infiltrating the police department this time. Without spoiling too many plot points, later on there's a music-related theme to their scheme this time, which is appropriate based on the notoriety of the previous titles in the series. It's a pretty flimsy plot, but considering the bulk of the game is walk right and beat up gang members, it's at least more involved than the first 2 games of the series. Previous games in the series took the fairly standard approach to beat-em-ups, where you start the game with a certain number of lives, and your goal is to make it through all the levels of the game without losing all of those lives. But if you do, you're able to have a few continues. This comes from the arcade origins of the genre, where if you lose all your lives, you can pop in another quarter. Streets of Rage 4 does away with this, sort of.
One thing that's very important to mention here is that Streets of Rage 4 is much longer than previous games in the series. I haven't timed it specifically, but I think a good estimate is that it's twice as long, on average, from time to complete the scenario, due to having more levels than any previous title at 12, and having slightly longer levels in places. Although certain levels, like the L train fight in level 7, are certainly much shorter. Due to this increase in game length and content, the developers made the decision to go with a more modern level progression system, whereby you have 3 save slots and your progress in the game is saved after each level completion, so that you don't have to have 2 hours to sit down and play the game through each time. You can always just take a break and come back. Instead, the game takes each level as its own event, and after each level, you always start the next level with a reset life counter and score. I really like this approach, and the only drawback I can think of is that if you've earned extra lives, those don't carry over, but they do affect your end of level score and level rank grade. And you may think, but Dave, I don't care about my score level rank. Well, you might think you don't, and in many games, yeah, your score doesn't matter. It's just a relic of the arcades and a way to show off to other players. However, your overall score in Streets of Rage 4 is very important because it leads to the game's best feature, which is the unlocking of bonus characters. What's this, you ask? Well, it's actually a feature that I was pretty skeptical about before the game's release. Along with the 5 modern characters that the game can be played as, all playable characters from Streets of Rage 1, 2, and 3 can be unlocked and used in the game, complete with original sprite artwork, although upscaled in the case of Streets of Rage 1 to match all the other characters. Score more points, get more characters to choose from. I was skeptical about this inclusion in the game in the beginning because it highlights just how similar Streets of Rage 4 is to the previous games, and how it's not exactly a major leap forward for the series, especially coming out 26 years after the last game. But when you temper your expectations a bit to be more in line with what the game is versus what the game isn't, it's actually a very entertaining addition to the game and allows for tons more gameplay variation, without the developers having to recreate art and movesets for 12 more characters. Fun tip, unlock one of the original Streets of Rage characters and press the special attack button. It's pretty great. Going beyond the standard gameplay mode, there's also an arcade mode, which functions more like the classic gameplay mode with a set number of lives to start out with that do carry over from level to level, but the key here is that if you attempt this mode, there are no continues. Now, you can earn score-based extra lives, just like in standard mode, albeit at different scoring intervals, but unlike previous Streets of Rage games, there are no extra life pickups on the ground. To me, this combined with the lack of continues makes arcade mode a bit too tough, but maybe some will appreciate the challenge. Both modes do feature 5 difficulty levels, just in case things seem a bit too easy or too difficult, and as you would expect, rankings and achievements are categorized based on the difficulty level you went with. One of the hallmarks of the series is multiplayer, and Streets of Rage 4 delivers in that regard. In a first for the series, locally up to 4 players at a time can take on the gangs of Wood Oak City? Seriously? What is this, Pokemon? Anyway, up to 4 players can combine to grind through the game connected to one console, or if you prefer, the game supports online co-op play as well. However, online modes are limited to just 2 players. I'm a little surprised that online is limited to just 2 players, since the game engine in modern consoles can run it without much exertion, but I'm guessing this was done to limit lag issues, which can be more pronounced in games where exact timing is needed. There's also a battle mode in the game that has appeared in the series previously, where players can take out their frustrations out on each other rather than against the computer, and it's cool that this was included, but I just don't understand the point in a world where Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat exist. Going way back, it's sort of like the Type B mode in the NES version of Double Dragon that no one ever played. It's cool that they added it in, and I'm sure it's fun to mess around with for a bit, but I can't imagine most will ever play it that much. The in-game graphics are gorgeous, to put it mildly, and to say that feels like you're playing a cartoon isn't inaccurate. Apparently, each of the 5 characters have 1,000 frames of animation, and enemies have 300 to 400, and it looks like it. The game will display in 4K resolution, if available, but no HDR. There are even some advanced display options that can be tweaked if you like a retro filter, but I didn't mess with any of that, as the version of the game that contains those options isn't available to Game Pass yet. Regardless, even with all the graphics settings at default, the game looks fantastic straight out of the box, and keep an eye out for little details that litter the background, such as other fights going on between gang members and police, or various callbacks to Mr. X in the last level, in particular a striking motif in stained glass. I kept waiting for a zombie or robot Mr. X to show up due to his presence in the scenery, but sadly that wasn't to be. As I've referenced a few times so far, one of the hallmarks for the Streets of Rage series has always been its soundtrack. Even Streets of Rage 3, which was much maligned at the time for a soundtrack that didn't match up with the first two games necessarily, but has since been recognized as being great in its own way and simply being a bit ahead of its time. .mu, knowing the soundtrack was hugely important in the Streets of Rage legacy, not only brought back Yuzo Koshiro to work on the soundtrack, they also included 9 other musicians in a mix of both Eastern and Western composers. And the result is a pretty great soundtrack. Obviously, it sounds quite a bit different than the 16-bit era, but in a way it still has a lot of the same themes and matches the on-screen action very well. Also, one of the benefits to having so many different musicians involved is that while the soundtrack is always coherent, there's also quite a bit of variety, which is definitely appreciated with the game length. And as a bonus, .mu included the soundtracks from Streets of Rage 1 and 2, and if you want, you can choose to have those tracks played during the game instead. To me, this is a nice bonus, but I don't see myself overutilizing it, as after years of playing the original games, those songs are tied to those games, and it just feels odd to be playing them during a different game. And like I said, the Streets of Rage 4 soundtrack is just fine on its own. I touched on the game's gameplay at the beginning of the review, and as I said before, if you're familiar with the series, picking up and playing Streets of Rage 4 is very simple. The reason for that is because nothing has really changed. There has been an Airbase special attack added to go along with the previous standing special that clears out enemies from both directions, and the forward special that is directed at enemies standing in front of you. And there's also been a star super attack added that can be used during a level for as many times as you've picked up stars during the level, or they can be saved to bump up your level completion rating if they're not used. But beyond those 2 additional attacks, if you can do it in Streets of Rage 2 or 3, you can still do it here, and based around the same button configuration as well. Now, I played the game via Xbox on an Xbox One and on a PC, and unfortunately playing a game on the Xbox app on PC requires you to use an Xbox controller. This worked fine, but what I really want to do was try to use my Retrobit 6-button Genesis pad on my PC, and that might still work if I was to obtain Streets of Rage 4 via a different source like Steam. I know it definitely works if you have a Switch. But regardless, even if I couldn't try using a Genesis controller to make things seem like 1994, controlling the game via the Xbox controller works fine, although it does take getting a little used to, as some of your muscle memory doesn't quite match up. Also, if you're using an Elite controller, however, I definitely recommend snapping in the classic D-pad accessory rather than the rounded one. And now, for the possibly controversial part of the review. When I first saw screenshots and gameplay of Streets of Rage 4, to say I wasn't impressed would be an understatement. What I saw appeared to just be a high-res remake of the previous games. Video games have changed a lot since 1994, when Streets of Rage 3 was released. And while 3D-based beat-em-ups haven't always worked, as an example, Final Fight Streetwise, Sega themselves have figured out the formula with their Yakuza series. In the past few months, I've been playing through Yakuza 0, as I mentioned last week in the Space Harrier review, and it's so much fun fighting both lackeys and bosses. I mention this because I see how Yakuza has turned into a huge series for Sega, and I think, wow, just imagine a game in the Streets of Rage universe running on that Yakuza engine. How awesome would that be? And I get a bit sad. I'm a huge Streets of Rage fan, and beat-em-up games can be more than just 2D side-scrollers, so I see some wasted potential. However, having said all that, Streets of Rage 4 isn't presented as a big AAA title. It's being sold more as an indie release with a matching price. So, as much as I might want a new massive AAA release for the Streets of Rage series, I can't judge Streets of Rage 4 based on what I want. I have to rate it based on what it is. And what it is a damn fine side-scrolling beat-em-up with great art and music, a decent length story mode, and extra characters to unlock to keep you playing the game and extend your experience. For all of that, I'm giving Streets of Rage 4 stars, and a nice return to form for the series that hopefully will open the door for future sequels, whether they be from .mu or from Sega themselves.
Okay, that was Streets of Rage 4. For a game that I was never expecting to see 2 years ago, and one that I didn't have high hopes for on announcement, I must say I was pleasantly surprised to see how this all turned out. It was really nice to pick up the controller, choose Blaze from the menu, and start tearing through Galcias and signals like no time had passed since I was in junior high. It's also a game that I'll be very glad to have a physical copy of, at some point. Hey, limited run games. If Signature Edition can figure out Xbox releases, you can too. Step up your game, please. Tune in next week when I head back to the Genesis and play a game that I picked out solely because it was on a lower shelf and close by when I was testing the Retrobit wireless Genesis controller. However, even though the game was a random choice for the next episode, that doesn't reflect on its quality, and it's actually a pretty well-known 16-bit title from Konami that had releases on both the Super Nintendo and the Genesis, and that led to plenty of fighting between the fans of each platform as to who got the better version. This will be my first time playing the game in depth since the mid-90s, and I never beat it back in the day, so maybe, just maybe, I can figure it out this week. Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.